Hello and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm your co-host, Brian Phillips, the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And as always, my co-host, our Vice President of Policy, Derek Cohen, is with us. Derek, how are we this week? Busy?
A little bit. Yeah. I mean, even if you look at some of the floor action and committee action from earlier on, you know, that was still at a clip because we're in that accelerating part of the session. But of course, obviously today, you know, we're recording this on a Thursday. We're going to have the Titanic floor discussions in both chambers, not to mention a very, I would say, a high-profile debate within the Senate Education Committee during the day.
And we will get to all that discussion this week, but suffice it to say, how many days do we have left? 54 days in regular session. And
don't put that evil out there.
I'm not, but it is, you know, it's always an interesting question to see if things are moving at the pace that they need to be moving in order to get all the major items and all the things done during the regular session so that there's not a special session. So I don't know if, you know, saying those words, you know, 3 times will make it magically happen. But we'll see. So I want to get to a few things this week. We'll want to chat about, obviously, the Trump indictment was a big thing. We'll maybe get to that in top topics later on in the show. But as always, we love your feedback. We love your responses and show ideas and topics and all of that. You can reach me on Twitter at RealBphil on Twitter. Reach Derek at Cohen at TBPF on Twitter as well. So you can give us your feedback. You can give us your constructive criticism or all your hate, whatever it is that you do on social media. All right, so we'll jump right in because, again, it is a very, very busy week. I've got a list of, a half a dozen, maybe more items that I would love to chat about today that are going on. But the number one thing, the biggest legislative priority, of course, is education savings account, school choice, parent empowerment. It's the biggest issue of the session. Today, this morning, the Senate Education Committee is meeting on these issues. Derek, where do we sit with SB 8, which is the bill number for the school choice bill, the education savings accounts bill? A lot has changed in terms of what that bill does over the last couple of weeks. Tell us right now kind of what the environment is for passage of that bill.
Well, I mean, just taking cues from other legislation, priority legislation that we've seen moving through the Senate, you know, I would still default to that this is going to pass the Senate easily. Well, I should say easily. I mean, there's going to be a predictable margin. You know, I could probably guess right now it'll probably be 18-13. If I were to proffer a guess. But I think we just saw with the full-throated support of the Lieutenant Governor, with the support of many active members in the chamber, both members who have been established and freshman members of the Senate, you know, we see a broad coalition of senators really getting behind this. And then we tend to see, I think, people having to default to their political priors rather than giving SB 8 a fair hearing, especially because, you know, half of that bill, you know, doesn't even have anything to do with education savings account.
Right.
It has to do with the Parental Bill of Rights. And I think that has really broad bipartisan appeal. But again, you got to dance with the ones that brought you.
And that's one of the things I wanted to get to is, you know, I have read the bill, unlike a lot of people out there who are commenting on it. And one of the things that strikes me is right up front. I mean, the first, 10, 15 pages of it really, I mean, like you said, don't have to deal with the most controversial element, which is the education savings accounts, but really do pack in a lot of protections for parents. I mean, there's the transparency measures, making sure that parents have access to the materials that classrooms are using, the materials, the lessons, to make sure there's a process for parents to get that information. The grievance process, going into and making sure that parents get a response if they have a problem or they have an issue with something that's going on in the classroom, that schools are responsive to parents' needs. They have a 14-day minimum that schools will have to get back and respond to parents. So there's a lot of really important things for parents in that bill. There's a lot of things for them to like. Is it perfect? No, again, but think about where we are in this debate. 2 years ago, certainly 4, 5, 6 years ago, the common wisdom was, because of the financial interests involved in school choice and kind of how the money moves and all that, everybody just said in Texas this was never going to happen.
Right.
And here we are. Not only is SB 8 being debated today, and like you said, is likely going to pass the full Senate, But then next week, it's going to go over to the House, where for the first time in a decade, according to our research, for the first time in a decade, the House Public Education Committee will actually hold a hearing on a school choice bill, a education savings account bill. So that's a milestone of their own.
Now, and I will go ahead and highlight, and all credit due to Chairman Buckley for setting that particular hearing, that the analog to SB 8 is not going to be heard. So, but that's because if you look at SB 8, it's more of an omnibus package on parental empowerment, generally speaking, right? And so the bills that are going to be heard in the House are more of the specific, like ESA rifle shots, education savings account rifle shots. And so the issue with that, obviously, it's still going to be a long, contentious hearing. But that being said, it'll be confined to that particular funding mechanism, as opposed to, I'm sure it'll come up, but like the things like the, let's just say, curriculum standards and content standards, won't be that won't be the front and center issue of that particular debate. Now, that being said, does that mean that it won't go off into those particular places? I believe it probably will. Now, I do hope that the chairman does set and enforce a timer. I've been through several hearings this week, including one late last night that neglected to do so. And when how the old "if you build it, they will come" thing. Sure. If you let people talk, they will talk. So and so that's
so you're there until 2:00 in the morning, just droning on about
exactly. And the thing is, obviously you want everybody to have a say within the democratic process, and there's multiple forums for that. The problem is, though, of course, if you monopolize, and we saw this with the gender modification debate in the House, is that there was not an enforced shot clock there, as I call it. And, some of these there was one witness who went on for an hour. And, it's just...
And they're supposed to have, 5 minutes?
Well, it's completely up to the discretion of the chair. Most chairs, if it's something that's really long and contentious, going to be a hearing, they'll set it for 2. The standard tends to be 3.
Yeah.
And usually, if somebody's in the middle of a thought and that little red light goes off that says that their time's up, 9 times out of 10, somebody on the committee will ask them to finish their thought. And obviously, if you've been asked to finish a thought or asked to finish a statement or something, that is that member giving that time to you. So that is an untimed an untimed part. But yeah, all that to say is, these people, and I would tell this to even people that are, have hostile intent to legislation we support, or even, people that are with us on whatever the issue might be. It's, if you can't get your points out in 3 minutes, it's probably not as hewn as it needs to be. It's probably not as tightly constructive an argument as it needs to be, because a good one lays out your whole argument in 3 minutes, and then it gives ample inroads for members to ask questions, and you can have that long-term debate.
Right, and it's it's a good process. I mean, I have my own concerns about. I mean, I worked in Congress. We don't have when I was in Congress, we don't have anything like that where where the public can come in and just talk for hours at a time on a particular issue. So maybe they do it the right way in Texas, maybe not. Maybe there's some tweaks that they could do.
Oh, it's better than the alternative, I'd say. Absolutely.
Right, exactly.
Just leads to some late nights.
and so segueing into the House, of course, there is a controversy in there. They're doing the budget today, and one of the typical amendments that always gets offered is to block any funding for school choice, to block any funding for parents to use public money to go to anything other than the public school. Talk a little bit about that debate. It'll probably be over by the time that we end up airing this this program. I'll talk a little bit about the ins and outs of that.
Well, I don't want to say too much about that particular amendment, because I think that there has been some maybe a little bit of laziness in its consideration and construction, and I think we'll have more clarity on that when we record next week. But yeah, essentially, like you said, what it does is ostensibly bans any form of savings account, grants, whatever the case might be. And, it was signed on to by, I believe, 1 Republican originally and 3 Democrats, and then 3 more Republicans came and signed on to it as well. And I find that somewhat puzzling, because it seems like that would be a vote that obviously, when it came time to vote, if it comes time to vote, would be something that then you could signal your colors. But in the meantime, signing on to something that is against the party that against the priority platform of the party you profess to be a member to, and obviously against the governor's number one priority, in which he has definitely put a lot of his own personal energy behind.
The politics, at least, are head scratching.
Yeah, so I don't understand. Now the policy. I mean, the policy is even worse. I mean,
Sure.
Granted, but that's coming from my particular point of view. Why you want to make sure that we lock, make sure we take chains to the doors of these failing schools and not let the kids out is baffling to me. But we've discussed that ad nauseum. But yeah, the politics of it are what really give me the concern. But that being said, is if and when it comes to the vote, I know that there's a lot of charged emotions there. Having looked over the rest of the amendment packet, I know that forcing votes on that is going to force votes on a lot of other things, in Article 3 specifically. Mm-hmm. And they're going to, if we thought there were things that were uncomfortable about that particular vote, I think there are things that are basically cataclysmic.
So hijinks and shenanigans could ensue.
It may, or they can use the House rule that was in Section 5 of the rules specific to the consideration of HB1 and just roll it all into Article 11, and then everybody could be home back in their district by 5 p.m.
And we will translate everything he just said next week on the show because we will know exactly what happened. So I want to get to some other...
springs eternal, at least.
I want to get to some other issues that are, just really some big issues. Power grid bills are going through the Senate right now. SB 7 is a really important bill. One that, and I'm trying to do the bumper sticker version of it right now. But from our perspective, it's a good bill because it forces the folks, the energy generators who are, shall we say, intermittent or not as reliable. Of course, that's more of the wind and solar type of generation. But it basically says, look, if you can't guarantee a certain amount of generation of power onto the grid when we need it the most, then you're going to have to pay for that. Then that's a cost that incurs amongst all the generators, and the folks who are the ones who are less reliable are going to have to ultimately pay for that. That bill passed out of the Senate 31-0. Now you would think there would be some a little bit more debate, that there would be a little bit more especially because a lot of people see it as targeting wind and solar or favoring fossil fuels, or at least that's the way some of the left have framed it. But it passed 31-0. Was that a surprise?
For that particular one, no. You'd be surprised how popular it is that when you take that little thing on the wall and flip it up into another position, that the lights come on. Yeah, that tends to be a fairly bipartisan issue. Now, I say that flippantly, but obviously there's disagreements on how do we get to a more reliable standard for the lights coming on when that happens. Now, this one I think is good because, again, this actually introduces a pricing mechanism into it translates reliability into the money side. Because imagine if you just had I can think of many jobs, several at the Capitol, where you just show up when you want to and you get paid for the days you work. That's essentially what it is when wind and solar are, turned on and blowing. And of course, with the subsidies, it allows them to actually bid in sometimes at a negative spot price, wherein they can actually pay people to take wattage off their hands.
Right.
And so I think that this is while it seems like it's a thumb on the scale, this is actually more of a free market solution because it introduces a pricing mechanism into the to take a phrase from Jason Isaac, to the unreliables.
Right. And so and the importance of this bill in particular is, there were some things done last session, some other things done this session that shore up the reliability of the grid, that prevent some of the problems that incurred during the ice storm 2 years ago. So we fixed a lot of that, but this really goes to fixing the system, like you say, like the pricing system, to make sure that just in general the grid is more reliable overall, not just in times of emergency, but just making sure that the grid is more reliable overall. So we'll see. A lot of folks thought that this would be more controversial, that there would be more pushback and more debate. 31-0 in the Senate, probably going to sail over to the House, and we'll see what happens there. Another big set of bills going on, again, education related, this time regarding higher ed. There are some bills going through the Senate today that are being debated. DEI, the elimination of DEI programs at Texas public universities. we've talked about this issue a lot here on this show. Just to kind of recap it, whatever the noble purpose of DEI programs may have been with recruiting minorities to different schools or different colleges, to getting more diversity in particular programs, whatever noble purpose DEI once served, it's pretty clear that now it only really serves as the mechanism to enforce this Marxist leftist philosophy, whether it's CRT or whether it's really just more of a socialist philosophy, to the things that we talked about, like the diversity statements, which are essentially loyalty oaths and all of that. It's morphed into this enforcement mechanism for kids to absorb and be indoctrinated with this leftist ideology. So that's what it is now in today. And of course, Texas isn't going to stand around and just let its public universities be overrun by Marxists. And so that's what the attempt is now, is saying, look, these DEI programs no longer serve the noble purpose. It's time to eliminate them. That debate's going on today. What's happening?
Well, and it's funny you mentioned that, because I'm a big proponent, and all my folks, I tell them, I subscribe them to Hanlon's razor, which is essentially never attribute to malice what can be attributed to incompetence, or in this case, at least just I would say just kind of nonchalance, because I come from that environment, and the way I've seen it, and having worked within essentially DEI hierarchies, one of the things that I've seen is not that if at the faculty senate meeting, they all gather up and say, okay, this is how we this is how we insidiously begin our long march through the institution. What it basically is jobs for the boys. You know what I mean? It's like, again, we were talking about these these sinecures, these as we talked when we talked about tenure. That where people basically come, they have nothing that they're accountable for. They have these things that sound good on paper, and it doesn't lead to any radical difference in the actual student body or even the body of the faculty, because they're not actually worried about diversity. They're worried about some of the stuff that are the signals of diversity. Like maybe, we have a 5% higher enrollment of students of color, or something like that. But the thing is, those fluctuations happen naturally. Both because of reasons that that university is doing, and ones that they have are completely beyond their control. And those, like I said, those fluctuations happen naturally. But you have basically now an entire body of administrators within the universities that when that arrow is fired and lands, they draw a bullseye around it and say, look at it, what we did. And this is not the only area where people have to make up stuff to justify their existence in academia. Trust me on this one. But that being said, it's just this hefty, onerous bureaucracy that does not contribute to the functional the functional use, the higher education mission of the particular university. Look, if they want diversity, I think that's great, but it needs to be diversity of thought, diversity of experience, and a lot of that will lead to, diversity of the immutable characteristics that they're so obsessed with. But, again, let's have a diversity of opinion. Let's have a diversity of background. Let's have a diversity of functional approaches to these problems that are confronting society, which is what the whole idea of higher education university was all about.
Exactly. And so one of the difficult parts of this debate is, how do you measure that part? Because, those on the left will, they will measure the things that you're talking about. What percentage of people, students of color do we have on campus, or what percentage of LGBT students do we have in this particular college or this particular study? And they'll just look at that and those studies. But it's hard to measure diversity of viewpoint to make sure that, like, in these classes and when they're debating these issues and they're supposedly seeking truth and discovery, how do you measure? How do you ensure that that there's a diversity of viewpoint there? And that's really a cultural thing, right? And so, and I think that's one of the things that the bill is really getting at, is that the cultural aspect of it has veered so far to the left, so that now it's not even just that that it just happens that most professors and most students are being pushed into this leftist thought, but it's actually being enforced, and that there's actually, when you come to these diversity statements and that kind of thing, if you're going to be on campus, if you're going to take these classes, you're going to have this particular viewpoint. And I think that's where the legislation says, look, we're not gonna do that anymore. We're gonna make sure that that there is more diversity of viewpoint.
Absolutely, and let me ascend that this is not going to lead to, this bill passes, it goes into effect in September. It's not going to be, now Texas is just a bunch of Bob Jones universities. That's not what we're going to have.
Right.
Here. What we're going to have, though, is essentially this meaningless checkbox or item to include in a tenure packet or job application is no longer going to be it. But now, again, does that mean all the universities are going to go right wing and we're going to, they're going to have, marches for life on campus? And none of that's going to happen. Right. I'm pretty sure Texas State and UT Austin are not going to just become overrun by the college Republicans after this bill goes into effect. But that being said, though, and again, you mentioned the cultural issue. That's something that is lost on this debate. It's not, people talk about there's, only 5%, or I think the latest estimate was 2% of university faculty identify as Republican, right? Obviously, not a whole lot of
diversity of viewpoint.
Yeah, exactly. Not a whole lot of that there. That being said, that's because most of and this is where folks on the right need to, actually earn their stripes, is folks on the right who are center right in academia, of which I know several. Then again, I came from, like I said, more of a blue collar, university, and our PhD program was fairly politically agnostic, which in the grand scheme of PhD programs, thus makes it about as far to the right as it gets because of how far that center of gravity is. But a lot of those people, the people that would identify as, centric, moderates even, libertarians, conservatives, so many of them are opting out of academia. Mm-hmm. I did 10 years ago. So it's one of these issues that, just like the cities we discussed, if you're abandoning the fight, it's something that, you can't really stand back and go, what's happening to this institution? Mm-hmm. Now, that being said, I do think there are instances of conservatives in academia being run roughshod over, and I think we can spend a whole episode on UT alone in that regard. But that being said, I do think that as long as, you get this requirement out of the way, and then places, especially departments that have to deal with a very broad ideological base, criminology, maybe not so much, but things like in the hard sciences and things like that, I think you will start seeing a normalization. Will it be balanced? Will it be equal? Will it be representative of the larger population? I'm very skeptical, but will it be better? Yes.
So jumping a little bit to less controversial issues, I just wanted to highlight something. We've talked about the Senate a lot, and the Senate is just moving bills as fast as they can, particularly priority bills.
They're earning their $7,200.
They are. They're moving. They're on the clock. 50-something days. Let's roll. But the House is doing a pretty good job too. One of the issues that we talk about, we try to highlight because it is such an important issue, though it doesn't get a lot of press attention for sure, is healthcare. And one bill in particular, and there's a lot of interesting sort of facets to this. One, I'll talk about the bill. This is a bill to require itemized medical billing. Mm-hmm. Now, dig into that a little bit. Basically, what it does is, and I'll just read from the story from the Texan. Friends of the Texan reported on this. The bill must include the full payment price, what you're going to pay, a plain language description of what it is, the service that you're receiving, and details associated with partial or full reimbursement from the involved insurance company. So basically, a bill that we all would get for any other service that we would be provided, fixing your car or some sort of, home service or something. They'd actually tell you what it costs, what they're going to do, and then tell you in plain language the service that they're going to provide. That doesn't exist, or at least apparently doesn't exist to that extent in the healthcare industry, which is incredibly frustrating for a lot of people. People really feel like they're being taken advantage of by healthcare providers, perhaps even the insurance companies, of course, and so you've got this bill which would require which really would protect patients, protect consumers, so that they know what they're getting into before these services. Obviously, non-emergency services. It's not like you get in a car wreck and all of a sudden somebody's going to come by with, okay, this is where we're gonna amputate your leg. But the other interesting part of it is that it was filed and is being pushed by a freshman, Caroline Harris, from Williamson County, just outside of Austin. Not only is it being pushed by a freshman, which you don't see, a bill of this kind of substance generally. I mean, and maybe that's true, maybe it's not. You'd love to get your institutional opinion on the fact that a freshman's pushing this bill, but also it has 107 co-authors, which means obviously it's got a majority of the House already in support. Obviously it's bipartisan. A lot of different interesting positive facets for this bill. What's your take on it?
Well, so you asked me about my institutional perspective on freshmen carrying bills of this magnitude. When I started in my first couple sessions, I would have been like, wow, that is something notable. But more and more, we're seeing these freshmen, that's not to denigrate their abilities or anything, but this is just an observation of there's going to be a growing pains and a job, there's no other job that prepares you for what it's like to be in the legislature. I think at least, some of these people come from like city council, which is a completely different setup. Mm-hmm.
But also, not to cut you off, but also, bills of substance, you got members who are, 3, 4, or 5 terms, they've been waiting their turn to introduce kind of bills of substance. And maybe that's why you don't see it as much, is because, now you've got a third term member who wants to really push a bill and do something for his constituents or so. That's why this maybe is a little different.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I will say about this bill, and I mean this with absolutely no slight to Representative Harris, who's absolutely, I think we can say objectively has been just absolutely killing it this year. That it seems, now granted, it's more complex than it seems because of about pricing and, kind of overcoming the impulse to put Medicaid, medical coding items there. So you basically, what does the Medicaid billing formula or Medicare billing formula look like? And putting that there so that you said plain English is something that it actually does. It seems simple, but that's the simplicity or the parsimony of the bill itself is not what makes it difficult. It's obviously specifically with this bill, Ms. Harris has to actually push against a pretty pronounced body of special interests, that kind of like the status quo and like the way things are going. And again, I'm, is one of the ones where I try not to default to malice, but I think it's just a lot easier doing things the way they are, and maybe keeping people in the dark in the way that it happens in the status quo is something that does redound to a bottom line benefit. But at the very least, we know that changing, changing is tough, and nobody wants to change. So credit to Ms. Harris for bringing that. Again, saying the bill is simple, I think kind of undermines the what she's had to do to move it. And I think that, going forward, this is the kind of item that you can build a resume off. Last night I was in PIFs, the Pensions, Investments, and Financial Services. And Representative Troxclair, former city councilwoman here in Austin, basically had a bill that you would have to go, everyone called it the Project Connect bill. Because what happened with Project Connect is basically voters were sold a bill of goods. They voted on it overwhelmingly. And that bill of goods never came delivered, and then they think that for to provide something else, they don't need to come back to the voters.
And of course, it's going to cost twice as much. And
and I am sympathetic to the inflation, though. The people that were lamenting the inflation, their policy preferences don't. Their aversion to inflation is selectively applied, I think we can always say. But that being said, she was pushing against that. And again, it just seems so simple, saying, look, any sort of debt obligation taken out in the name of the voters should be voted on. And if you take out debt in the name of the voters and don't actually deliver, I'm sorry, they need a vote to see if we're going to continue down this path, because, essentially, one bond election does not a blank check make. And, anybody that has any experience in municipal finance understands this. The problem, of course, being like, oh, well, we'll have to have elections for all this. You have to have elections for every major bond issue as it is. And that's the way that's the way it's always going to be. And I'll be damned if we're going to step away from that, because, these city councils, through many of these other mechanisms, whether certificates of obligation or the tax revenue anticipation notes, all these other fraudulent, let me pause. Tax revenue anticipation notes. That's a fraudulent means of getting.
We talked about this last time in the
exactly.
issue with
COs have their place, certificates of obligation, but they do need massive oversight. And so the fact that we're dealing with that here, we're never going to step away from voter-approved debt.
Right.
Because otherwise, then the cities will just absolutely
But
run roughshod.
in general, we'll just say kudos to Ms. Harris, to Representative Harris. Being a freshman, taking on that big issue, as you said, it on its face, it feels really simple. It feels like something that should have happened a long time ago, but it hasn't because it is so sophisticated and so complicated.
And the special interests are raised against it.
So two things I want to hit. Again, there was a ton that was happening. Just really quickly, it's kind of I don't know if it's a joke or it's creating all kinds of controversy, but they call it the drag show bill, which is essentially codifying drag shows as sexually oriented events or businesses, and then preventing minors from being. It was kind of a circus during the hearing a little bit,
so to speak.
Yeah. Well, the one thing I wanted to bring up with is of course, and it passed. I think it passed the Senate, and so now the Senate has approved that these businesses that produce these sexually oriented content no longer can have minors there, which I obviously think is a good thing. But my point is that this all happened over the last couple of years because of the grassroots. I mean, this really was not necessarily an issue that had bubbled up to the surface. It wasn't an issue that a lot of that members were filing these bills year after year and waiting for the time. It really came from the grassroots. It came from these shocking videos that were taken and then were publicized through social media, where you see men dressed as women, scantily clad, basically performing strip teases in front of children who are giving them dollar bills, and it just horrified Texans. That's just not who we are. It's just not the values that we hold. And so that issue was really pushed. And so it is kind of a milestone, a successful milestone of the grassroots, conservative grassroots, that bill, not only was filed, but was made a priority early in the session and then passed through the Senate.
Yeah, and I think, again, how many times have we gotten on this show and talked about how, reality versus how things are talked about in the media. And so it is funny. So I actually... I came about this bill. I get back to my desk and I see it up there because obviously it wasn't one I was following explicitly, and I was hearing like, oh, this is basically going to be the pretext for rounding up all the trans folks and sending them to the camps and stuff like that. Like this is what was said during the hearing by some of the witnesses, and so I was like, oh my goodness, I got to read this bill. What is going on with it? That's not good at all. All this does is it says that if the show itself is explicitly sexual in nature, then it can't be in front of kids. So if everyone's like, oh, well, this will prevent Drag Queen Story Hour. This explicitly will not. Explicitly will not, because it requires that prurient interest. And so it's funny that it gets discussed as such. And this doesn't criminalize drag. It only criminalizes drag that is explicitly sexual and targeted at minors. Right. And so I just don't understand why we can't have this discussion about this, because I do think there is a values discussion. I do think that people can differ on this. Well, obviously I have my priors on this, but people can differ on this. But when when people go so hyperbolic to one side of this, it goes, look, if you're going to force a binary, no pun intended given the subject, but if you're going to force a binary, that it's like we're going to have these or we're not going to have these, and that's the other side, and that's the horrific examples is the ones that they're saying there shouldn't be any problem at all. Right. I'm sorry, I'm just on the bad side.
And so much of this particular issue, whether it's the gender modification or bathrooms or men playing women's sports, the left has gone so far they just absolutely refuse to have an intellectually honest debate about the issues. And so this one, obviously it was targeted towards kids. we still have drag shows are still legal. Like there's no one's stopping. There was ridiculous testimony during this time. Oh, this is going to prevent people from having certain Halloween costumes, or a man dressing like a cheerleader or something and going down to 6th Street, which is all just nonsense. And they just go so far to the left that, if you want to have the debate, that's one of the reasons why we started this show. We call it The Right Idea because we want to talk about the ideas. We want to talk about the policies and what gets to the heart of the debate. And so many of these things, particularly on this kind of issue and things related to this issue, get so far to the left and get so crazy that they're not really having an intellectually honest debate about it.
I have to say, and again, back to Hanlon's razor, let's not blame malice for what incompetence will do. I'm just assuming these people never read the bill, because you can't read there's no
They just read the newsletters and the legislative alerts from the far left groups.
Yeah, and that's the thing, though. It's then you want to actually have a discussion with people, and they will say, they'll get up in your face and say, this literally criminalizes drag, and it goes in a very applied context, like, when there's nudity, when there's explicit, content within the show, and there's children present.
Yeah.
And so that's a big conjunct there.
So there's two other things I want to get to. I know we're kind of running out of time here, but we have to talk about SB 23. SB 23 was a priority bill of the lieutenant governor, and that passed through the Senate. This bill, I'll just read from our friends again at the Texan. Approved a bill that would require people who use a firearm while committing certain felonies. So they're already in the store trying to rob it, or they're burglary or something else. Committing a certain felony but using a firearm would serve a minimum of 10 years in prison if convicted. Judges wouldn't be able to offer people charged with gun-related crimes the opportunity to have convictions wiped from their records, even if they successfully complete the probation. So this is putting some real sting, putting some more sting. This is Republicans, getting tough on crime because, Texas, obviously, we've got some issues over the last couple of years. And this is a big priority bill. Senator Huffman ran the bill for the Senate, and I believe that it passed. I think it did pass. What's your take on this bill?
I'm torn. So Texas, if you look at how our criminal justice system in Texas works, we've largely rejected the use of mandatory minimums. We have always been a broad sentencing bracket state. And then if we wanted to increase the potential punishment, we would usually get in a code and say, whereas jaywalking right now is a second degree felony, obviously it's not, but jaywalking a second degree felony, and we got this plague of jaywalking, then we're going to up it to a first degree felony, and then there's going to be broader sentence ranges for that, right? And then obviously with the jury sentencing, it'd be something that we do there.
So you're saying that in Texas generally it gives judges a range of options versus saying, look, if they are convicted of this crime, you have no options. Judges, you must give them this kind of sentence.
Yeah, or at the very least establishes the floor. It does. I mean, they can still give them
20 years or 30 years or whatever.
Exactly, so long as it's within the bracket of whatever the underlying offense is.
Right.
And so the reason I'm torn is not because I don't think that people that get charged with this go away for a long time. The problem is creating, when you have any sort of determined element of a sentence, the problem is really making sure that you're capturing the folks and the behavior that you want to capture. Now, I applaud Senator Huffman, Chairwoman Huffman, because she's, she as a former judge, she knows what she's talking. This is not like her, happening across this area and then blindly stumbling through this. She knows what she's talking about, and being from Harris County, she sees firsthand, has constituents who are being victimized firsthand. What happens when we see basically just a lax application of this? Now, that's on the upside. So yeah, people that instrumentally use weapons to commit crime, 10 years, no skin off my back for that. Here's the issue that we run into with mandatory minimums more broadly elsewhere too. The reason that we have crime going up, especially in certain jurisdictions, is just because the absolute abdication of the rule of law in these areas. Now, I don't necessarily believe that Kim Ogg, who's the DA of Harris County, is going, he had somebody just, fire into a crowd of people. I'm sure there's root causes at work. Well, let's plea them down. That's not her style, but you do have other district attorneys, such as in Dallas, such as in Austin, such as in, you don't have a district attorney in El Paso anymore, but she had vacated because of just the absolute horrible job she was doing. But people are on this, we're not allowed to say, Soros backed, even though literally he goes, I back these prosecutors, and it's because of their particular stances on crime. But you have these people that are deliberately disengaging from law enforcement. Now, here's the problem with this, is that once you have the statutory construction there, it's going to be applied all over the state, including places where this stuff's not happening, not happening frequently. But then when that person when that prosecutor wants to punish that individual, they are now, bound to the mast of that particular sentencing scheme. Now, will it still happen in the woke jurisdictions, the Harris counties, and the Travis counties? that's the issue. We've passed in the Midwest, in the 70s and 80s. This was a big push. It was the mandatory minimum specifically for gun crimes. This is something I studied in graduate school. Essentially what you've seen, specifically in the state of Michigan, because that was one of the big bellwether states to put this type of policy in there, basically say mandatory minimum for the existence of a gun. And again, it doesn't necessarily, broker any caution there. The problem is specifically in Wayne County, where Detroit is, prosecutors just, when somebody robbed somebody, they just would never enter a gun into the charging document. So now we have this space, so they want the flexibility, the ability to extract the plea to be able to do that, which just forgoes. And so they would just stop adding the elements that trigger the enhancement. So now we have to believe so in Wayne County, where people going around, give me all your money, giving finger guns at people, or like, how are you going to stick somebody up with a weapon and that weapon's not actually going to be entered as an element of the case? And so that's the quintessential problem.
So what you're saying is, instead of forcing the prosecutors to seek, at least the minimum penalty here, that would require people to go away to jail, they just ignore facts of the case in order to give themselves the flexibility that they no longer had?
Absolutely. And as you know, there's parallel legislation going through about reining in rogue DAs. Even with what looks to be going through with that, I'm not sure that is going to provide that surety, that factual element that somebody used a gun. And again, the issue, the language could be tighter in the bill in terms of, because it says use or exhibit, and that's fairly broad, because what if it's in a waistband, we can get it, but that's minutia. Let's just talk about the broader point. That gun just might not appear in the charging document in the case, so that a plea can be extracted. And like I said, even if the rogue DA's legislation goes through and passes, I'm not sure that will be enough to compel them to do that.
And so, I mean, I guess to the point that it could create some unintended consequences. Maybe they can tighten it up with language in the House. But look, the whole point is we've talked about this several times. Is that when it comes to criminal justice, we're trying to identify who the real bad guys are, and put them away so that they are no longer a danger to the public. I think that is obviously the spirit of this law. But to your point, if it has been implemented in other states and created these unintended consequences, maybe we need to learn from that and get some research down there into our friends in the House so that we can tighten up that language.
Absolutely, and this is not like I said. Well, do not take this as a screed against this bill.
It's still a great bill.
It's a very tough thing to do, because you're basically trying to thread 3 or 4 needles in a row. You need to account for the facts of an offense. You need to account for the facts of the offender being criminal history. You need to account for the district attorney of that area, and you got to account for the judge. And that's just one iteration. And so that 4-dimensional problem exists in 254 different individual iterations here in the state. How do you do that? That's more faith. That's more faith in local elected officials than I think I have.
And that's the kind of the point, is that it really hits at this issue that the public sees what's going on and they're angry about it, and
rightfully so.
And they don't trust that these prosecutors are doing things in the public interest. You know, we see people who should be behind bars getting out on bail, and that can create, when they're getting into all that issue as well. But I think this is a response to that at least the people, are demanding that if their local folks are not going to do the right thing, that the state get involved.
And our response is justified. Is this the right one? We're going to have to see.
All right, so we've gone really, really long, but I want to get the national news. We can't get out of here without talking about the Trump indictment, the politics, the policy, the craziness of all of that. We've all probably digested that, particularly in conservative media, we've all pretty much digested that these are, for lack of a better term, trumped up charges.
I saw it coming and I could do nothing about it.
Yeah, I know. It's not really anything that you can say, but it is ridiculous. The process by which that they indicted the president, particularly how they elevated it to a felony. Everybody knows those details, so I don't necessarily want to belabor all of the nonsense there. But do you have a different angle or a different take on this that you want to talk about?
A different take, no. The one thing I would highlight is that you can, regard your opinion of Trump, what you think of him as a man, as a president, as a presidential candidate, should have nothing to do with your interpretation of this particular case. this is probably, and again, coming from somebody who's been in this world for, going on 20 years now, this is one of the most flimsiest indictments I've ever seen. And the fact that it was 34 counts, just a what we call a stuffed indictment, meaning that basically every paper that was printed in part of a fraudulent transaction would be then its own item. It's absolutely not. And the legal theory that they can enforce federal election law at the felony level within the state courts is actually, antithetical to other findings that we've actually had in recent Supreme Court cases, not least of which being the Prince case, the anti-commandeering case, being that it's basically saying that the federal government can't tell local officials what to do. And the rationale that arose from that was essentially, look, if they're doing the business of the federal executive, the president needs to have the ability to fire or fire, discipline, or and control the federal workforce. Mm-hmm. What's he gonna? Is Joe Biden going to reach down and fire all the ADAs under? I mean, obviously Bragg's elected, but all his ADAs. Mm-hmm. Is he going to be able to do anything? Absolutely not. What about Arizona v. U.S.? You might remember it being the show me your papers stuff that was going on there. That essentially that actually put up another firewall saying that, look, even if the federal government is abdicating their responsibility, the state can't therefore preempt something that is essentially a federal priority. In that case, being immigration, here being election enforcement. To the tune of paying $130,000. To
hush money, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. But all that being said is that there are two cases. One that says state can't do this. The other said that feds can't do this. Mm-hmm. And very establishing. It's like two bright lines that are not touching,
right.
and so it's
which is why previous prosecutors had declined to take the case for over the last 5 years.
Absolutely.
You obviously have Alvin Bragg, who ran on his platform was going after Trump, and now he's got to make good on his campaign promises, I guess. But the whole thing, the politics of it is pretty interesting for me. I mean, when you evaluate, obviously this is going to put Trump in the news. Yeah. Which is exactly where he wants to be, and he loves controversy. He creates controversy so that he can get in the news. He thinks it's all inures to the benefit of his presidential campaign. He's given now 2 or 3 rallies since he was indicted to demonstrate that he is out and free and that he is fighting all of this. And so it's hard to tell right now how obviously all of this is going to play out in terms of the presidential campaign. And there's a lifetime between now and Iowa of next year. We're going to have 5 debates this year alone. We'll have obviously 2 with Iowa and South Carolina next year. And so there's a lot to go on. This doesn't, anybody coming out and prognosticating that, this guarantees that Trump is now going to be the nominee and that he's going to win the presidency. Look, there will be a lot of people who were not Trump fans who will say, look, this is wrong what they're doing to him. I don't know that translates into a primary vote for him necessarily, particularly if you've got other alternatives like a Ron DeSantis or others out there.
I think people are just tired. I think people are just tired of all, like the everything dialed up to 11 all the time. Mm-hmm. It's like holding the side of your face against like a belt sander. It just never lets up.
And that's, but getting back to session with that segment.
Yes, exactly.
All right. So we've gone way over time, but that's because we have a ton to talk about. I literally have 3 or 4 other issues that we didn't get to. Maybe we'll try and get to those next week. But this has been great. It's been a ton of information. That's exactly why we try to do this program, is to give you the bottom line and kind of cut through some of the smoke and mirrors and all that's going on with how people frame these debates and get right down to the nitty gritty of what's going to happen. So a lot going on today. We're excited to see kind of where we'll be with a lot of these issues next week. So as always, we'll sign off for now. As we always like to say, in the words of Sam Houston, do good and risk the consequences. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.